Hello, my friends. What's up? It's your buddy Phil here. We got a question from our friend Sean today. You need to listen really close because I am in transit. I'm in motion. So I'm just really going to be speaking as I drive along. And I would like to address the questions that Sean has sent in the group. And I'll share this with our wider students on YouTube as well. So, Sean says, I have a few questions. I want to better understand the resource and procurement connection because I look at external resources such as vendors and contractors and equipment, supplies, materials, etc. as resources. That is correct. They are indeed resources. And it goes further to say, I know in short that procurement deals with external vendors and discusses more about make or buy decisions, conducting procurement, and making sure both parties adhere or meet performance objectives in the contract. That is correct. However, I want to confirm, when planning and documenting within the resource management knowledge area, are contractors and vendors recorded as a resource within the resource knowledge area plans and documents? So let's get it straight, Sean. When we talk about resources, we need to be very specific. You got human, you got equipment, you've got materials, you've got supplies, you've got facilities. Therefore, the vendors in and of themselves cannot be anything other than human resources. When we think about human resources, we could think about these individuals, these entities, for sure. However, when we talk about the materials and the equipment, the supplies, the facilities that we may be renting from them or we may be procuring from them, these are looked at as physical resources. Okay? So when we say vendors or contractors under staff augmentation, definitely you could account for these individuals. Now, it really depends on the project. Some organizations are opposed to having specific non-internal resources called out. In other words, some companies may use a generic resource name like plumber or electrician, and they may be a vendor, and that's okay. They just refer to them by electrician, plumber, whatever they are, you see. And that is commonplace, and there's nothing wrong in doing that in the documents in resource management. In other companies, people are averse to doing anything like that, so they may just mention outsource. But I think a best practice would be to make it as specific as possible, regarding the role that you are getting staff augmentation for, or project manager. Some other firms might go down to the name based on a staff augmentation arrangement that is already in place or that is coming down the pike. So there's no hard and fast rule regarding these things, as you can see in the PMBOK guide. The PMI uses language such as could be or could include, but is not limited to, and things such as that. And the reason why they do that is because there's a lot of variability in how projects are managed. And very recently, the PMI has tried to move away from strictly predictive project management, where a lot of these guardrails are in effect. All right, so keep that in mind. There's a lot of variability in how projects are managed in the real world. So to your specific question about including these folks in resource documents, sure you can. Sure you can. So Sean goes further to say, I tend to see external vendors on a long-term project as part of the external project team. That's true, and you could actually see such individuals as part of an internal team when there's staff augmentation, when they are actually on site, you see. But all of those are labels. The bottom line in resource management and procurement is, what are the resources I need? Human equipment, material, supplies, facilities. Am I getting any of them from external? If so, I need to know which ones they are. I need to create the dependencies in the schedule. I need to ensure those resources, whatever they may be, are delivered at the right time and are used in the right way. We need to make sure the consultants are paid at the end of the arrangement. Things such as that. Okay? So Sean goes further to say in your 3-year project and you create an RBS that includes your project team structure, would or could the RBS document include your external vendors? Why not? Absolutely. And contractors? Absolutely. It could. But again, you are putting these resources in there because they are human, performing some sort of staff augmentation. You may not put the resources in there because they are supplying a deliverable or supplying materials. You get what I'm saying? So the mention of the resource there is for staff augmentation, but the actual physical resource should be mentioned. Now, if for one reason or another someone wants to put a label as far as which vendor or which supplier is providing that, well, that's okay. Like I said, there's no hard and fast rule about how these things are done. Okay? It is very situational. And at the end of the day, it depends on the organization behind the project. Okay? Good. Let's go to Sean's next question. So when estimating resources and coming up with resource requirements documents and so on, would all resources, including external resources, be documented in the resource requirement document? Now, there's no resource requirement document per se in the very beginning. I think what you're saying is resource requirements, would those include external resources? Absolutely, they should. So when you get to the end of the estimate activity resources process, what do you get out? Resource requirements. I think that's what you mean by requirement document. So you get resource requirements and you get your resource breakdown structure. Absolutely. Nothing precludes you from putting those folks in there. They're working on the project. They're humans. Or a material is being supplied by these folks. Again, it's absolutely okay. Okay? In plant resource management, Sean says, could you also be focusing on describing how to acquire external resources? Absolutely. You could be focusing on how to acquire resources, period. That's really it. How are we going to acquire resources? And if those resources are external, that could be part of the discussion for sure. And there could be overlap. Now, if you realize that these are external resources, the moment you're talking about acquiring external resources, you are shifting focus into procurement. You need to be careful with this because the place to focus on external resource acquisition is majorly in procurement management. Is there overlap? Yes. But the PMI are very specific in showing you that when you are negotiating in acquire resources, you could be negotiating with an external source. But you also need to remember that that is going to overlap with procurement. So there are overlaps, and that's okay. But I would rather you focus on the external resource acquisition from a monetary standpoint and a contractual standpoint in procurements. That's what procurements are for. That's what the knowledge area is for. Does that make sense? So while there's overlap, the knowledge area where that is majorly focused on is, again, procurement. You could also see similar overlap when you're trying to recognize the stakeholders mentioned in Chapter 13. Yes, there are stakeholders mentioned in Chapter 13, and indeed, stakeholders could be vendors and suppliers. So you do need to engage those folks as well. You see what I'm saying? So everything is overlapped. Everything is overlapped, but you need to give honor to which knowledge area is predominant in the discussion. Another example would be in stakeholder management versus communications management. Now, the dialogue in stakeholder engagement, managed stakeholder engagement, is pretty much managing stakeholder engagement involves working with stakeholders and communicating with them. So you could ask the question, oh, it says communicating. Where does this take place? Well, there's obviously overlap, but the main knowledge area, the dominant knowledge area for communicating is communications management. Does that make sense? So when you're thinking about these things, you will find overlap in a number of places, but it is important for you to realize the most dominant area in the discussion. Okay? So moving forward here, let's go to your next point regarding the statement of work. SOW. We need to be careful with the SOW, by the way. So procurement management is dealing majorly with external resources. Yeah, that's it, pretty much. External resources. Contracts/agreements between buyers and sellers. That is correct. More of a phase-to-phase management view. It could be phase-to-phase, but it could also be across an entire project. It may not necessarily be for just one phase. If a vendor is supplying across multiple phases, then you would have a more project view than just phase-to-phase view, so to speak. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, talking about the procurement itself, when you manage procurements, you could look at the procurement as having a life cycle. We could talk about the procurement life cycle. So you could look at a life cycle for procurements, and you could say, I'm managing the procurement as it moves from phase to phase within the procurement life cycle. You see? So there are many ways, as you can see, to skin project management. With the PMI, they are not necessarily saying every single process has to be done in one way or no way. They're not saying that. But it is important that you realize the predominant area, which it seems like you have in this message here. All right. The final paragraph here, and I'm just going to park and read it. It states, SOW requirements could be possibly mapped to the resource requirements. So it's important that when we use a term like SOW, we need to know which SOW, because it could get a little bit muddled and hazy. So SOW stands for Statement of Work. The question is, whose statement of work are you referring to? You could be referring to a statement of work from your customer, or you could be referring to a statement of work from you to the vendor. In that case, we would call it a procurement statement of work. So it is important that we define very clearly which SOW we're talking about. So in this case, I'm going to have to read this a little bit more to really understand which SOW you are referring to. Because in the PMP guide, they took away the previous mention of SOW in initiating. It's not there anymore. So when we talk about SOW, we see it mentioned loosely as SOW once or so in procurement, but it's really a procurement statement of work which you send to the vendor that is being discussed there. Nonetheless, let me read this last paragraph. So last paragraph, SOW requirements could be possibly mapped to the resource requirements, which are both mapped to the requirements document and the charter. Not necessarily. So we don't want to create any new documents that don't exist. So there's really no document that maps an SOW to resource requirements. Though theoretically, you should think about how you're going to get each requirement done. But there's no document that does that. See? Also, the charter, because the charter is so high level, its aim is not to plan. Okay? It's just to get people on the same page and to enable discussions and dialogue towards planning. But the bottom line, Sean, is requirements in general. I don't want to label them as SOW requirements because I don't want to confuse anyone else listening. But let's say you get a high-level narrative of what the customer wants. We would call that an SOW. So if you read the high-level narrative, that could give an inkling into what scope you need to do. I would rather you think about mapping the scope baseline and its elements to the resources. And in that way, we're talking more about a RAM, a responsibility assignment matrix, that maps resources to work. I would rather think about that, right? So, resource requirements, which exist in the form of work in scope documents such as a WBS, when you flip the WBS on its side and you juxtapose it with an organization breakdown structure, you get a RAM. That's how a RAM or a RACI chart is formed. And absolutely, that is one of the things you should do. So I hope this message helps you. I hope it helps you think through all the information. The key takeaway is a lot of what you've asked is definitely legitimate because there's no hard and fast rule in the world of project management. But when it comes to the PMP exam, it's very important that you realize the most dominant knowledge area, okay? And then when it comes to using terms like SOW, in the PMP guide in chapter 12, we talk about the procurement statement of work, and you do not want to mix that up with the once upon a time in the PMP guide statement of work, which is from the customer. So there's you, right? You're carrying out the work for a customer. The customer gives you a statement of work. Now, that statement of work, you may need help to carry out that statement of work. So, you enlist vendors or sellers. When you send out the piece of work that you want them to do, we call it a procurement statement of work. It's not very well explained in the PMP guide, but that's how it is. All right. I hope this helps, Sean. Great questions, and